Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Telemedicine Talks. This is your host, Leah Damasco. Thank you for joining. And hey, Happy New Year, everybody. 2026 is upon us. I can't believe it. That happened so fast. First, I just want to say thank you to all the listeners out there that are listening now and that have joined us, especially from the very beginning. Phoebe and I started this podcast in February 2025. It was really just, hey, we just wanted a forum, a mode to just talk about telemedicine, share what we knew, and get people on to talk about the telemedicine environment and to share kind of the knowledge out there. We've had some great people on, and we are looking forward to continue that in 2026. We're super stoked, super excited. Our January 2026 calendar is full and we're excited to bring more of this telemedicine talks to you. So thank y'all for being with us and getting us through 2025. So really right now, given the new year, I just wanted to take this episode to talk about and reflect what we saw in 2025 and maybe talk a little about what to expect and what to look out for in 2026. So let's get with it. So 2025, if we could sum it up in a few words regarding telemedicine, I would describe 2025 as a year of reflection, accountability, and maturity. So really, when telemedicine blew up in the pandemic, right? Telemedicine's always been there. It's been here for decades. We've talked to people who started up telemedicine practices the decades before the pandemic, but we saw this huge boom during the pandemic, right? And it was needed, right? We couldn't see patients, doctors couldn't see patients, and patients couldn't get their care in person because we're all confined to our own 6-foot radius, right? And telemedicine was a needed modality to provide that essential care. Laws were changed, practices were changed, businesses popped up, and doctors started changing their practices, started transitioning to solely telemedicine and started making money for it, right? But now when the pandemic started dying down, started fizzling down, and people started to migrate back to their pre-pandemic practices being seen in person, brick and mortar locations, what we saw was telemedicine kind of retracting a bit, right? And in 2025, we saw a little bit more of, I wouldn't necessarily say a retraction, but a change, right? And during the pandemic, what we saw were creations, which is a big boom of a bunch of telemedicine platforms that offered direct to consumer care, urgent care that had really no focus, just kind of just provided broad care, right? Come and get it. Hey, we provide any care, all care. And in 2025, what we saw was that these practices, these platforms that provided direct to consumer care, actually struggling. And actually, some quietly just went away. They just fizzled out. And what we saw was that a transition to more focused care. And not just that, instead of direct to consumer care, businesses started transitioning to enterprise partnerships with payers, with employers, with location cities. And yeah, and this was needed, right? We saw Teladoc move further away from growth at all costs and move towards enterprise partnerships. Amwell started leaning deeper into health system embedded virtual care. So yeah, gone are, I think, are the days of these broad-based, unfocused direct-to-consumer care and now focused care, right? You saw that too with the specialized care platforms, Hims, Hers, they started banking on the verticals, started expanding the verticals and things like that. That's a big change. Another thing that we saw in 2025 was this focus now on compliance, governance, standardization, accreditation. And this is a nod to Phoebe, right? And she's always been preaching, hey, compliance, standardization, and rightly so. In the wild, wild west time of the pandemic, these businesses were stood up and just started going, started practicing. But the framework for governance compliance wasn't set up. So you had all these businesses doing things and not necessarily being regulated, right? And they could do almost kind of whatever they wanted, right? Now, the doctors were there practicing and, it was up to the doctors to provide care, but they didn't necessarily have the framework to be supported for that. or there's just no framework at all. So it was just whatever happens, happens, right? But what we saw in 2025 was that telemedicine no longer flying under the radar of regulatory care or the regulatory oversight, right? We saw the regulatory bodies focusing on telemedicine, focusing on accreditation. Companies started formalizing peer review and credentialing processes according to like NPDB, right? Companies started getting accredited using like URAC accreditation to becoming more formalized. States started focusing on these PC MSO relationships, right? Trying to make sure that, hey, actually the clinicians are running the practice groups and not necessarily the corporations, right? Or is who's doing the hiring? Are there clinical standards set up? Prescribing audits started going, right? And this was reflected by kind of the legal things that we saw, the lawsuits that we saw, the legal actions, right? We talked about it in a previous episode, talking about the Done Global and the Cerebral platforms facing lawsuits and facing both monetary and even jail time for poorly controlled prescribing practices. We're starting to see PCMSO structures being shut down, right? And especially in California, being more scrutinized because they're starting to see that some of these relationships were just pass-throughs and the PC owner wasn't actually involved, right? You're looking into billing, marketing, and claim scrutiny too, investigations into billing practices, employee contracts, also looking into HIPAA and privacy. Before, it was just kind of willy-nilly and just the second thought. But now compliance and these regulations, instead of being nice to have, is now business critical. And I think we're going to continue to see that. Now, in kind of the same vein, right, what we also saw was clinical standards being applied to telemedicine as well. Like I was saying before, when these telemedicine practices were started up, it started up so fast, they just relied on the clinical practices of the physicians practicing, right? There wasn't necessarily standardization. And I saw this when I was practicing, and this happened a lot in kind of the urgent care realm. Hey, it's just that you practice like you practice in brick and mortar. But now what we're seeing is more clinical protocols being enacted. A good example is Amazon Clinic, Amazon One. If you haven't been on that or worked on that platform, they have very strict inclusion, exclusion criteria where you have to stick closely to it. Not just that, even if they meet the inclusion criteria initially, there are certain specific pathways that they want you to follow. And personally, I agree with this, right? Telemedicine is not necessarily just like brick and mortar. And there's a lot of times you have a lot of different providers providing care to the patients on these telemedicine practices. And these telemedicine guidelines provide a good framework for that, right? What we saw without these guidelines is just non-standard care, just care that one person doing one thing, another person doing another, and the patients don't know what to expect or, can have contradictory care. But I think with with the focus on the platforms and the guidelines, now you have these standards that the physicians practicing can rely on and can fall back on, but also the patients also have clear expectations of what we can and cannot do in telemedicine. And I think that is super important, especially in a practice where we treat all types of patients, all types of physicians jump on, and it's treated across the nation. Right. And I think it also instills a sense of trust, right? Instead of non-standard care where patients get care one way in with one provider versus the other, the standard of care kind of instills this sense of trust and validity in the practice. Right. Now, I think another thing that we saw too was empowerment of the physician within telemedicine. What you saw was, I think, more physicians transitioning to telemedicine as part of their primary practice. A lot of times it was their side gig. But what you saw a lot is that doctors are now seeing that, hey, I could create a career out of this. And they're incorporating telemedicine more and more into their practice. And not just that, I think the doctors now in telemedicine are realizing that they have a voice and that they have leverage and that they could use this voice and leverage to create work environments better for them, pay compensation structures better for them. What we saw was some pushback against kind of just opaque compensation models, sometimes unsafe visit volume. So the physicians were actually dictating the care that they were giving and how they were getting paid. But also what you saw too was a lot of physician-led organizations, also doctors taking the medical director roles and really also becoming ownerships. You were seeing more and more, I think, doctor entrepreneurs taking ownership of structures. And these platforms too are seeing the value of this, right? They are realizing that, hey, physicians are a huge asset to your company. And actually, they value getting a physician on board and being part of their leadership structure. And I think this is a good thing. And I've talked about this before. And in brick and mortar space, we've lost leverage. We've lost our leadership roles. We've given it up because we wanted to focus more on care, right? I've seen this a lot. You see this in big health systems. You see this in practices. The doctors were thinking that, hey, we didn't need to do the business side. We were just all medicine. We'll have somebody else do it. But the side effect in that is we've lost leverage, right? We've allowed other people to become leaders in that space. And now in the brick and mortar space, at least, the care that we deliver and how we deliver it is dictated not by doctors. I think in the telemedicine space, I think it's still new enough and I still think it's still pliable enough where doctors have now come in and have taken up those leadership roles. And I think as long as we continue to take up those leadership roles and seek those leadership roles, I think we'll still be able to dictate care and be leaders in this space and not give up that leverage. So that's nice to see. Being a doctor and being a medical professional actually became an advantage. And the platform saw that as a competitive advantage. They saw our value. And 2025, we can't ignore AI. Huge, huge, right? We see this out in any other sector, right? AI is huge. And you saw AI getting into telemedicine, right? If you went to the big conferences, ATA Health, AI was first and foremost, and it struck me when I was at Health this year. This is an arbitrary number, but the majority, 80, 85%, I don't know. The point is, the majority of the people out there, the stands, of the talks, we're talking about AI. You can't escape it, right? Now, most of the times, you don't even know AI is running. Most of the times, the AI is actually running in the background of these platforms. They're either running the front end of it, taking calls, doing triage, so forth and so on, but they're there. But also what you're seeing is creep of AI into the actual patient care. You see a lot of these platforms that are suggesting diagnoses, that are suggesting kind of care modalities or, the management to the doctors. But what I've also noticed is that there is, I think, an appropriate, but a good amount of pushback that is disallowing AI from actually providing the totality of care, right? What I don't want to see is AI taking over care altogether. And that's a big concern, right? That AI is going to push us out of our jobs, right? AI could do a better job of that. And I think that, the leaders at B and the physicians have done a great job at making it a point to say that AI can't do that, right? We're going to need actual people dictating care and actual people, making the final decision. We can't necessarily have AI providing the totality of care. And I think we've seen that. The attempt to replace clinicians outright isn't there. It actually kind of failed. And I think as physicians, we need to continue that front, right? This is why we went to school. AI can't necessarily replace kind of the in-person thinking or experience that we have. Right. So yeah, that's 2025. Now, what do I think that 2026 is going to look like? I think kind of continuation of what we've seen in 2025, right? So in terms of business models, right? I think again, the broad-based urgent care platforms out there that relied mainly on or started with a direct to consumer focus is largely going to go away. These broad-based direct to or broad-based urgent care platforms will continue to need payers, will continue to need private insurers, Medicare, Medicaid, enterprise kind of relationships to continue to survive. And we're seeing that, right? When I was starting to work on these urgent care platforms, yeah, they were all direct to consumer, but now there's a big push to partner with the payers, right? And you're going to see that. Now, I think what we're going to have to be careful about is to ensure that, when we create these relationships, that the payers or whoever we have relations with is paying or compensating the telemedicine practice appropriately. So that's, I think, is going to be a struggle in 2026. Now, let me rewind because I totally forgot about one big thing that happened in 2025. Let's talk about the Medicare extensions, right? So we're talking about these Medicare extensions, right? So we've talked about this a lot, right? And these Medicare extensions during the pandemic, pre-pandemic, let me rewind even more. Pre-pandemic, telemedicine was not paid by Medicare. And there was only specific instances that Medicare paid for telemedicine. You had to be in a specific location, specific people had to provide the care. The patients had to meet specific criteria. And with the pandemic, these rules were relaxed. They call the telemedicine flexibilities, right? And Medicare was now allowing people to be seen through these telemedicine platforms. Also, controlled substances you get through telemedicine. Now, these rules were set to expire, and every year after the pandemic, they were set to expire, and they were set to expire around September, but every year these rules were extended. And this year, this was supposed to, in 2025 was supposed to expire in September. And just like prior years, it was expected to be extended out. But because of the government shutdown, these flexibilities were not extended. And this actually created problems. People expected this to be extended and it wasn't. And immediately there was fear that Medicare wasn't going to pay out telemedicine practices. And so platforms started or stopped providing care to Medicare patients. Investors stopped investing into platforms, especially Medicare heavy platforms, and it created a problem. Also, there was a threat that all these patients that depended on telemedicine couldn't get their care. Now, once the government opened up, these telemedicine flexibilities were extended, but only temporarily. Most of these flexibilities were extended only until January 2026, right? Now, the controlled substances deal was extended out through December 2026. So that's out of the table. But the other flexibilities, who could see the patients, where you could see the patients, what types of patients could be seen, were only extended out through January 2026. Now, everybody expects these flexibilities to be extended, right? Telemedicine has proved its worth, and taking out these flexibilities would be a big blow for patient care. And people, I think, overall want to extend these out. I think everybody thinks it's a great idea. But I think the hesitancy is the lack of still oversight framework, right? There's a hesitancy to make this permanent because there's not a good oversight framework to make sure that this is done correctly. So I think that these flexibilities are going to be continue to be pushed on down the road, pushed until maybe the end of the year, so forth and so on, which is good, but there's always going to be a question mark overhanging it. There's always going to be an uncertainty, right? And so, and I think this is going to continue in 2026, right? I think this is going to be a factor in companies fully investing in telemedicine, into companies fully going all in into providing care for Medicare patients. That's another thing that we're going to see in 2026. Another thing I think we're going to see in 2026 is kind of furthering of the rules, further tightening of the scrutiny of accreditation, regulation, so forth and so forth. The regulators are moving towards clearer and stricter guidance. So the companies that actually spent money in compliance, and actually made an effort in the front end are going to have an advantage. And the companies that didn't are going to need to catch up. It's not going to get easier for them, but it's going to get clearer, right? There's going to be more definitive standards that are going to be applied. Now, one thing that I hope to see and I want to see in 2026 is this idea of precision leadership. I think we have realized that, hey, we can be leaders in this space. And I hope to see that idea grow. I want to see more physician entrepreneurs starting up these companies, more physicians taking these leadership roles in the C-suite, right? I'm looking forward to seeing that. And also, and we can mention this too, integration of telemedicine, right? Deeper integration within health systems, employers, locations, FQHCs. Talking about that, there's the big grant that's out there for rural health. I think telemedicine can play a huge role into that. And what I hope to see is people tapping into funding sources like that to help further telemedicine, especially in rural places. Also, what I think is going to happen is there's going to be more hybrid care opportunities or more hybrid care practices out there. So not strictly telemedicine, not strictly brick and mortar, but these brick and mortar practices can expand their footprint using telemedicine, can make their practices more efficient. So I think we're going to see more of that instead of this strictly binary kind of modality. I think, we're going to see more of a mixed care kind of environment. What we're also going to see, and I expect, is that the telemedicine environment becoming not necessarily more efficient, but skinnier. Basically, again, there was this big boom in during the COVID times, right? And you've seen a lot of businesses, seen a lot of business kind of ideas. And what we're going to see is a continued consolidation of these practices, right? We're getting a better sense of what works and what doesn't. And we're going to see more of the platforms that don't work just fade away. And the platforms that focus again on these relationships or focused more on focused care, providing only specific services are the ones that are going to survive out in 2026. There's going to be rising expectations for clinical standardization, rigor governance. So I think those are all going to be dictating factors in who's going to survive 2026 and who isn't. There's going to be a lot better care, I think, and less noise within the telemedicine community. Yeah. So those are my expectations or what I think is going to happen in 2026. Yeah. So if you have any other ideas, any other thoughts, please drop me a line. You can reach us at Telemedicine Talks at leo@telemedicinetalks.com. Also, you can reach Phoebe at phoebe@telemedicinetalks.com. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to get you on the show. We love having guests on, just talking about their experiences, really just hanging out. This is more of an informal conversation. So please jump on the show. We'd love to have you on. Drop us a line at info@telemedicinetalks.com. And we look forward to having everybody listen, to having more people on, and excited to get on 2026. Thank you all for listening and see you next time.